Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to Viva Nutrition Radio. This is your host, Andres Ayesta, and I am excited to bring you Mr. Cockfit today into our podcast as a guest. Jabien, that's actually his name, is a certified nutrition coach, personal trainer, and life coach, and he's the founder of Mr. Cog Fit, which stands for, or I think he broke it down into the podcast, explain it as like the combination of cognitive fitness, mental, and fitness all together. So I loved his approach to nutrition because he loves research. He loves to understand it. He loves to really dive deep into it. And he also had a weight problem, and he learned to overcome it. But what's interesting about him is like he went on a low carb diet to be able to lose a lot of the weight. But after the fact, he started to really understand the why behind his decisions. Reason why it was so really cool to hear his podcast or to hear his like what he had to say in today's podcast, and I'm sure you will do as well. Just going to give you a quick outline. We talked about his weight loss journey and how he kept the weight off. The problem with nutrition research and how people interpreted it typically, the insulin model of obesity, which is something else that was huge. The problem with doctors providing nutrition advice, and some of the things that we definitely kind of talk as far as that, organic versus non-organic food, and sustainable weight loss recommendations as far as that. So I hopefully you enjoyed this episode. But before I let you go, I wanted to also let you know that we are in the process of opening up some more spots as the time that I'm recording this. This is August 20, I think August 18th. I'm recording this, and we're going to open up some spots for September to bring in new clients and new people that come into the nutrition program to help you maximize your health, to help you achieve your goals in nutrition, whether it's weight loss or fat loss or optimal health, through nutrition coaching and personalized nutrition strategies that can help you accomplish your goals. We've helped over 100 people, actually a lot more than that, hundreds of people, dozens of people, to get to their goals in a way that is sustainable, but not only achieving a body transformation, but one that is also transcends into your mindset transformation, and help you really not only lose the weight or accomplish fat loss, but also being able to keep it off in the long term. I always like to tell people losing the weight isn't 10% of the race, but 90% is actually being able to maintain those gains or the losses of weight that you achieved. So if you're interested in that, in the show notes, you're going to find the links to be able to be a part of us. You're going to be able to apply. The way that it works is you will apply to our nutrition coaching program. You'll get on a phone with our client recruiter, Roxy. She'll be able to define whether your goals are going to be aligned with what we do and that we're a good fit. And then if that works out, then you're going to move into having a conversation with me where we're going to dive deeper into your goals, the struggles, the gap that we need to fill, and then obviously the strategies to be able to help you get there. And if we're a good fit, we'll decide who is the best coach to be able to help you, and we'll give you an opportunity to join our team. So if you're ready and prepared to do this and to really like bet on yourself and take your things to the next level, and you're freaking tired of like doing things that are not long lasting, and this is your chance to apply to our Viva Nutrition Signature Coaching Program. The link is in the show notes. Now, without further ado, here's Jaebien, Mr. Cockfit, in episode number 92 in Viva Nutrition Radio. Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to Viva Nutrition Radio. I have the pleasure to have the one and only Mr. Cockfit. What's going on, brother? How we doing?
Hey, how are you, Andres?
Good. So happy to you're taking the time for the podcast, dude. Like, so we were talking before. Obviously, we kind of hit that record button. That I kind of found you doing, or like you were doing some sort of like a webinar or like a presentation on beef and protein eats and stuff like that. So it got me interested to bring you into the podcast because I went on to your Instagram and I kind of found that you teach nutrition education through in like really funny ways, memes and infographics and stuff like that, which was pretty awesome. But before we kind of get into all the nutritional parts of it that we're going to be talking about today, why don't you tell us a little bit more about you and what kind of got you like in this exploration phase into learning more about nutrition yourself?
So pretty much nutrition happened by accident. Originally, I started on my health journey. I was morbidly obese. I was pretty much pre-diabetic. So I needed to make a change in my life. And the quickest way for me to make a change was going on one of these fad diets. So I went on a low carb diet. I lost about almost 90 pounds. And that's what really started me on my health journey. And then eventually I learned that that wasn't sustainable for me. So I started to put two and two together, like, what the hell is going on? Like, what am I not doing right? And that's when I started learning about health information. I stumbled along the way because I started falling into like fads and misinformation. But eventually, like, I got certified. I started following people like Lane Norton, and I really started to learn about evidence-based nutrition and science-based nutrition. And believe it or not, by trade, I don't even study nutrition. You know, this is just a hobby of mine. My things that I study in college and do research on are actually psychology, and I'm also a double major with philosophy. So this is really just a hobby of mine that's taken
Really?
off.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. Now, and I want to go back to, because obviously it sounds like you did have obviously some, like, weight problems at some point that was kind of led you to do something about it, and kind of like trigger that. And so tell us about that journey, and what did you learn? Like, because I think a lot of people nowadays are probably going to go just like you, like, I'm going to go into low carb diet. What prompted you to do that? Was it something that you read, or something you're like, oh, like, there's like, this is like the typical thing that most people do to lose weight, so I'm just going to do it? And what did you learn about yourself in that process when you were kind of like, you lost the 90 pounds, what happened then?
Yeah. So can I curse on this
Yeah,
podcast?
fuck
Because
yeah, dude.
I
Of
got a lot of
course.
shit to say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So
dude.
I think a lot of people start this journey. They want to make a change. They don't know how. So they learn it from a family member. Because a lot of people think that they're nutrition experts because they have a fork and a knife and they read it somewhere and that they should do X, Y, and Z things. So it was actually my grandma who suggested that I do like Atkins, right? And she was like blaming the carbs and saying that it was all the carbs. And in my mind, I didn't know any better. So it made sense. So I was just like, I need to make a change. I need to make it right now. This seems like the easiest way that I could do it right now. Um, and then the weight started dropping off, like it started dropping off rapidly. And I didn't realize that it was because of the water weight, and things like that. And it was a really long and grueling process. I wasn't eating enough calories. It made me get into spirals where sometimes I would binge on food because I was being so restrictive. It just wasn't a healthy way to lose a lot of weight. I didn't know that at the time. And most people get into that point where they want to do something, they have such motivation and willpower, but they struggle so much because it drains them so much. And at the end of that process, a lot of times they go right back to their old habits, and then they regain most of the weight back, if not all of it back, if not more of the weight than they originally lost. And it's fucking crazy, man.
Yeah.
So what I did was I developed habits that helped me keep it off, and that one of the biggest ones was exercising and trying to cut down on my calories in certain areas. But I didn't know that at the time until I got to this point where I'm like, okay, what kept me in this situation now where I've kept off a good chunk of my weight loss for 5 years, which is beating the statistics, was these habits that I adopted. And now it took me recently to realize that. It's fucking crazy.
And yeah, dude. And I think like people, like the a lot of people that listen to this are like, yeah, that's exactly how I started, because I feel like it's for most individuals that are trying to lose weight, like nutrition always kind of starts with like somebody like, hey, you should try this, you should do this, and you see the weight drop, but then you're not developing like kind of like the mindset, the behaviors to be able to kind of sustain that. So I think that's like, you mentioned like you're kind of majoring in psychology, you do have a degree in psychology, so the psychology of eating and nutrition is a big part of it that many people don't really kind of like pay too much attention to. Like, and I usually tell a lot of our clients like, hey, I can tell you what you need to eat and you can probably do it and you'll be motivated to be able to do it. But it's kind of like the toll mentally that kind of plays into that, because if you don't change this, then obviously that's not going to kind of lead to something that is sustainable from the looks of it, of what you experience, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think we talked about in the beginning, you have to think post diet, right? Because the people, when they use diet, I always define it as a pattern of eating. Most people, when they say diet, they mean the short-term approaches like keto, like veganism, vegetarianism, paleo, whatever it may have you, Whole 30, whatever short-term diet is out there. They don't think about what happens after I stop doing this, because most of the time they can't sustain it forever because it doesn't fit into their lifestyle. You realistically can't do keto for a long time if you fucking love pizza and desserts and shit like that, because you're not allowed to have that. So you're gonna probably crave it more. You're probably gonna, when you have it, not know how to act. You're probably gonna overdo it. So it's like, how do you approach these issues intelligently? Like, how do you think post diet? Like, what are you going to do after the fucking fact? Like, how are you going to sustain this weight loss for long term? Most people don't think like that. They just
Yeah.
want to drop off the pounds as quick as possible.
Yeah, they want to get to the instant gratification result, and then they just don't like. And I usually tell everybody, it's like, getting to the weight goal is the 10% of the race. 90% is being able to kind of stay there and to be able to kind of sustain it. So now, when
Exactly.
I also want to kind of know the transitional phase from, like, okay, like you lost all the weight, and you started, like, it sounds like at that moment you kind of started into this process of like wanting to learn more about nutrition. So I'm guessing you started connecting the dots of why something worked and why it didn't work and so like that. What were some of like your major like breakthroughs that you started to kind of like diving into the research of metabolism and nutrition science and understanding exactly how it's all comes, it doesn't have to be rocket science in a way,
Yeah.
which I think it's like, a lot of people try to make it super complicated nowadays. So what were some of those like major breakthroughs that for you, like, okay, like it's like aha moments when you were kind of learning a lot of this like nutritional science?
So what really spoke out to me was, I noticed that when I went low carb, I felt like shit. But then when I had my carbs, I felt better. I felt more energized. I was in the gym. I couldn't perform as well because I wasn't feeding myself carbohydrates. So I started to realize my body preferred to have carbohydrates as fuel for my workout. So I'm like, what's the science behind this? And then I look into it. Most of sports nutrition agrees carbs are fucking important for lifting. They're important for sports performance, and they're important for your daily function. There's no reason to restrict them without any type of reason. Every single macronutrient is important in their own way. And then I started to realize, hey, I want to start building muscle. So then I realized, protein is important. And then I'm like, okay, why is fat important? So you see how I started to learn about each macronutrient. And then once I learned about the macros, I'm like, okay, there has to be something more than this. What about my general health? And then that's when I got into vitamins and minerals. And it's like, why are vitamins and minerals important? What do the different vitamins and minerals do? And then boom, you start learning about a whole bunch of different shit. And I'm like, okay, how do I lose and gain weight? Because the carb approach just didn't make any sense. The low carb approach just didn't make any sense, right? Because in their theory, right, for the insulin model of obesity, if I go low carb, I should lose weight forever, because the insulin. But my weight loss was plateauing, even though I was really low carb and not eating any carbohydrates. So I'm like, okay, there has to be something more to this. And then I learned about calories. And then that's when the whole game shifted, when I learned about calories, because then you learn about metabolism. And then you learn about how metabolism is pretty much adaptive. It's not a linear process. And that is what got me here today, where I know a lot of the shit that I know now.
And I think it's been a while since I talk about, like you mentioned, the insulin model of obesity. I think that's, and I know you do bash a lot of like the keto, the keto community, like you fucking destroy them. But let's talk about that. I think like a lot of like the low carb, the low carb communities are just kind of blaming everything that's happening to our society, the obesity epidemic, and all the different things that we got going on right now. It sounds as though it's insulin, right? And they talk
Yeah.
about like insulin is elevated in most people, whether you're like, and then you have like the some people on TikTok talking about like, well, keto is effective for specific health conditions, and which I have my thoughts about that too. But in general, most people are blaming their problems of like, oh, your insulin, and low carb is a way to control your insulin. So what are like your initial thoughts on this, and how do you typically kind of educate on this type of topic? And I know it's a beast to talk about. So
Yeah, it is. My first issue with low carbers is when they mention sugar, right? That's such a broad fucking term. So what do you mean by sugar? Because, the vegetables that you're eating contain sugar, right? Because they're carbohydrates as well. If you're talking about a cookie, that contains sugar. If you're talking about fruit, that contains sugar. So there has to be more context than sugar. Sugar is such a broad fucking term. So when I usually approach these problems, I'm like, hey, stop talking about sugar, talk about specific foods. So if you're talking about, so people love like low carbers love to blame the obesity epidemic and diabetes on sugar consumption. So when we talk about sugar, I like to get to the definition of ultra white refined sugar. That's the one that they're usually talking about. So it's like, okay, how does that, how does that consumption compare to the rates of obesity rising and diabetes? When you actually look at the data, sugar consumption is decreasing while diabetes and things like obesity are increasing. So it's like that doesn't fit into the low carb narrative. What's consistently increasing is our overall caloric intake. And the foods that these low carbers talk about that they hate so much, cookies, desserts, candy, these things often contain high amounts of sugar and fat, and they're low satiety, so they're very easy to overeat, and they're low satiating, so they're not going to fill you up. So you're probably going to eat more. There was an awesome study done by Kevin Hall where he had participants eat ultra processed foods, which are foods that contain high refined sugar and fat, versus people that eat more whole grain stuff, more fiber intake, less processed foods. And the people that consumed the more overly processed foods ate more, and like that's kind of like a no shit moment for many of us. So when we talk about chronic illness, it's not really a matter of sugar, it's a matter of a chronic caloric surplus. People are eating too much, and as we know from the metabolism doesn't really adapt as well when you overconsume calories compared to when you're in a deficit. So your body is not going to try to, if you're in the right, not in the right circumstances, like as in a good thing, but if you're in the wrong, in like the right circumstances for the wrong things, your body's really not going to adapt or tell you really to stop eating as much, and it's a whole science behind that, and it's fucking complicated.
And I think people just kind of like rely so much on that fact that, and like usually the narrative or like the question I ask a lot of like the low carbs is like, well, if let's say for example for one moment we will go back to like before, like we were industrializing kind of like ultra refined foods and stuff
Mm-hmm.
like that, and let's say you were living on a freaking farm and you had your own food and you had your own cows and all these different things and you were eating fruit and you were actually kind of having sugar and stuff like that at home and making stuff with it, do you think you would have the problems you have today? And I think usually the answer is always going to be probably no, because the
Yeah.
problem that from what you're mentioning is not really coming from a specific macronutrient. It's just simply the overconsumption of everything altogether, right?
Exactly. Yes, yes, yes. And that's the problem. The modern food environment, we're just consuming too much food because it's a lot of times it's overly processed. And it's a bit more complicated than that. Like we could get into the different physiology of it. We get into the socioeconomic aspect of it. But it's very much more complex than the low carb narrative of big sugar is making you fat. Just way more fucking complex when you look at the data.
Well, and I love to dive into details like that because you did it. I mean, you actually kind of implemented this for yourself, and I think you probably realized that the weight dropped because of like the caloric restriction that you created as a
Yes.
result, right? So from the physiological standpoint, and based on the stuff that you looked into, is it more metabolically efficient to be on a low carbohydrate state, like reducing your insulin levels, compared to like a non approach where you're like lowering carbs, from what you know?
From my perspective, what really leads to the best weight loss successes are adherence. So how long and how well can you stick to the approach that you're with? Insulin doesn't really fucking matter, right? Because when you compare low and high carb diets in a control feeding study, that's just a fancy way of saying like in a study comparing both of them, there's really no weight loss difference. So your macro distribution as far as carbs and fat doesn't really fucking matter. And even like there was a recent study that suggested that a high carb diet, low in fat but high in fiber, could probably lead to more potential weight loss, just because fiber is very satiating. So like you just eat less,
Yeah.
and I'm sure you saw my vegan post. One of the studies in there cited for athletes made it a point that it's very hard for athletes to gain weight on a vegan diet because of that,
So
what
much
I just said,
fiber.
the diet. Yeah, so much fiber. So it's really fucking hard for them to gain weight. So if you're a bodybuilder, it's fucking tough for you to gain weight as a vegan or a vegetarian compared to
Yeah.
something else.
So what do you think, and I know that you posted recently about this, like there's so many health professionals, like right now, even doctors, dude, like physicians,
Yeah.
like heart surgeons and all these different things pushing this like low carb narrative. Like and it's crazy because for some reason I feel like doctors discovered TikTok in a way that they can actually spend more of their time outside of like, hospitals and stuff. And now they're really kind of pushing this agenda on this. And and or people like fucking like Dr. Stephen Gundry. I'm sure you saw the post about like Lewis
Oh
House, which is
man.
that we can probably like talk a little bit about that. That'll be a fun conversation. But in general, what do you think? Like this people like this health professionals that people look up to are are kind of like basing a lot of their stuff on. Like, is there really a lot of research to kind of for them to say? And I know you talk a lot about this in some of your posts about how people interpret research, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think my biggest problem with doctors is that they're really fucking intelligent in their particular specialty. Like I'm never gonna be a fucking cardiologist, no matter how many books about the heart that I read, right? The issue
Mm-hmm.
is that they don't have this, a lot of them don't have the same respect for other health fields. So now all of a sudden, you get people like, Stephen Gundry, you get people like Ken Berry who think that since, all right, I'm a fucking doctor, so like I could just read biochemistry, I could just understand biochemistry and boom, I understand nutrition, when it's way more nuanced than that, and they're not trained in that field. They don't understand the nuances in that field. So they're going to read a scientific paper from a biomedical standpoint, from a biochemical standpoint, and they're just going to think that low carb is the way to go. Because when you look at it from a biochemical standpoint, it makes sense, right? Because insulin inhibits lipolysis. So that's like the breakdown of fat. And it encourages lipogenesis, which is the creation of fatty acids, the creation of fat. So you think, all right, in a perfect world, this should cause you to gain fat and inhibit the fat in your body from breaking down. That sounds really well and good until you look at physiology, because the body is not that fucking simple. There's other hormones that inhibit insulin or enhance insulin. And then when you look at the outcomes, the human outcomes that we just talked about, there's no difference between high or low carb diets. So a lot of times, and in addition to that, from misinterpreting data from that standpoint, they're just incentivized a lot to state bullshit. Because if you think about it, the mainstream media doesn't give a fuck about science. They care about attention. So when I come up with a diet hack, they love that shit. You know why? Because it's more eyeballs. And then the doctors love it because then they get to sell their piece of shit book and they get to sell their supplements and they make a lot of fucking money compared to doing surgery. And that's another point that I keep saying. They make a lot of fucking money from stating this nutrition BS. Not just the ketogenic doctors, the carnivore doctors, the paleo doctors, the vegan doctors, they all make a lot of fucking money off of this shit. So when they talk about big pharma and stuff like that, paying stuff off, look at where their finances come from, because they get a lot of money based off of books, supplements, coaching, whatever the fuck that they do. They get a lot of money for it. And they probably get a lot more money than they would paying a doctor.
Yeah. Well, like I remember I have talked about this in the past. Like doctors don't get like formal training in nutrition. Like they
No, they
like
don't.
and you ask like someone's like how many classes you took on like nutrition and like metabolism. They sure they take like some biochemistry classes, but like I'm from Venezuela, so like
Yeah.
like even there it's only one class. And the class that doctors usually take, they take it in within the nutrition school, like the nutrition faculty. So and then here in the US it's literally pretty much the same exact thing. So like that's like what kind of like what qualifies you. But then since you have the ND or like the medical doctor in there, then typically kind of like they go based on that. So that to me is kind of crazy. Did I lose you? Oh, there you
No,
go.
no, I'm here. I'm sorry. It was just some noise. Yeah, it's really scary when you think about it. They don't receive a lot of training in the U.S. I think it's like probably like less than like a 3 credit class or something like that. I'm not in med school obviously, but that's not the focus of their training. The focus of their training is not nutrition. It's they learn so many different things. And I'm not shitting on doctors. I'm not saying that doctors are bad
Yeah.
people. I have a lot of doctors that follow me, a lot of amazing doctors out there, but they don't specialize in nutrition. They don't understand the nuances. A lot of them don't understand the nuances of the research. So they can't be making these claims based off of faulty data. they need to understand the nuances, and they need to consult actual nutrition experts like they would any other field, because it's its own specialty. And I think that's a problem in the health sciences in general, where people are like, oh, I'm in one area of health, so I should understand all of health. And in reality, they don't.
Yeah.
They really fucking don't. So
Yeah, and that's kind of like I feel like it's and I can see in the narrative on this kind of like topics, and it becomes repetitive and harmful in some ways, or it's just difficult for people to make decisions based on this, because they're like, okay, a doctor is saying this, right? So like I should probably
yeah,
listen to that person. So it makes it so hard. Now, I guess like now talking a little bit more on the topic of like interpreting research. I feel like because
yeah.
a lot of these doctors typically go read an article and it confirms something that I talked recently about, this confirmation bias, right? So it's like trying to
Yeah.
kind of prove a point and finding something that is. And I kind of explain this in a way like, if you Google alkaline diets and you in your mind, you're like, alkaline diets are probably a good thing. You're probably going to find things that confirm that for you. And you're, like, yeah, the
Mhm.
research says this. What are your thoughts on this? And what is your process? I guess like for you, and you call yourself a self-thinker as a way to actually kind of interpret the research and stuff on your own, what is your process to make sure that you are objective in the way that you actually look at nutrition research and how it can be implemented or applicable to you?
I think my first go-to phrase is, if it sounds too good to be true, it most likely is. So if the narrative sounds too good and too convenient to explain everything, and there's no nuances to it. So with your example of the alkaline diet, if people are touting that this could cure everything, I'm really fucking skeptical. It needs a lot of evidence behind it to prove, like, well, not really prove, I don't really like that word, but to provide evidence that it does that, right? It needs a lot of fucking evidence. So when I go look, do I find a lot of evidence? And if I do find evidence, does that evidence confirm what the claim says? And if it does, how strong is that evidence? So that's usually my frame of mind. Where's the evidence? Does the evidence confirm what the person is saying or not? And how strong is that evidence? And where can I go from there? Because a lot of people understand how to read an abstract, but they don't understand the limitations of the research itself. And the issue is that they only read one or two papers. I try to read as many as I can, given the time, and trying to really look at, is there any meta-analysis? Is there any systematic reviews? And if so, what studies are they citing? And then I go read those studies to make sure that the meta-analysis and systematic review is okay and accurate. So it's really time consuming. It's tough. And a lot of people don't have the time, the mental energy, and it's very inconvenient because like they just want to answer, so, and it's not that simple.
Well, and I think also nutrition research in general has its own set of flaws, and I think I
Hmm.
watched a very recent video on how like it's really difficult to trust nutrition science and nutrition research nowadays, because there's so much that is or there's so much stuff that influences it. So
Hmm.
you talked earlier about big pharma, you talked about obviously the food industries and all these different things, and I think that's a big problem. Like, for example, like people don't understand, they read a study and they're like, okay, they don't look at where the funding sources is coming from, and not necessarily that that's a bad thing, but a lot of
Yeah.
times it could kind of skew the results that of what's presented. So do you also sometimes find that like even nutrition research in itself is hard to trust, or how do you actually kind of like set the difference in there? Because literally like you can go in and read a specific kind of like research study on a specific compound that was like literally funded by the company that actually has the compound or so like that. So how do we figure out a way to I guess like the question trying to make is like, how do we make sure it's actually something valid? It's something
Yeah.
difficult to do.
So my thing is that as a person who's had a background in research and doing research and like writing grants to get funding, it's tough to get funding for research, right? So sometimes you got to do what you got to do to get the funding for your research, especially if you're in grad school, you're trying to get your PhD, you're trying to get your master's. It's tougher than a lot of people think to get research funding. They just think that money just falls out of the sky. It doesn't. It takes time. It takes effort. And it takes a lot of work. You're going to write a whole entire grant proposal that's going to take you a long time. and a lot of people are probably going to reject you. So that's something I want people to consider at home if they're listening to this. And also the fact is that that's one factor out of many that determine the worth of a study. So is it something that is in the back of my mind? Yeah, probably. You know, like if they're saying that this let's say a supplement, for instance, if they say this supplement's effective, and you look at the funding, and the funding comes from the company that sells the supplement. Of course, I'm going to be a little skeptical, right? Because it's like, of course, they're going to fund a study that finds the answer, but I have to look at the research for what it is. Did they do the methods right? Did they do the stats right? Is their conclusion in line with the methods and statistics? Is the limitations of the study, like, do I understand the limitations of the study, and is it said? You know, and what's the background research of this? So there's different factors, and I feel like funding is important. Don't get me wrong, but it's often just one piece of the big puzzle. And if you don't understand the full puzzle, if you don't look at the full puzzle, you're missing out on the full picture. And then you're going to make conclusions that are really just idiotic because you didn't look at the research. Like I get into arguments with some people. I send them a study and they're like, well, it's funded by big pharma, and it's like, okay, which companies and which authors? And they can't tell me. And they're like, how does that make the study wrong or bad? And they can't tell me still. So you need answers to those questions if you're going to make those assertions sometimes.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's always like difficult. But I agree. I agree that just because something is funded by a specific company and like that company is kind of pushing a specific product doesn't mean that it's bad research. You just need to kind of like look into the details as far as like what's presented.
yeah.
So, and that's important. Now, another part too that I always like to as a dietitian, and ever since I became a dietitian in 2012, it's crazy to think that I have changed my views on many different things. And because nutrition is an ongoing changing science, and I think there's always something new that may kind of like here's the best example, dude. When I graduated from college, and I went to like I worked a lot with athletes in sports nutrition. BCAAs were like a go-to recommendation. Like, you need to take BCAAs, branched chain amino acids, and now the research says that that's pretty a fucking waste of money. Like, there's absolutely no need for you to be taking that. And there's still a lot of professionals that still kind of believe that. So what are some things, the question that I want to get to this is, that's a good example, but what are some things that when you started thought were the valid or the things that you were supposed to do, but as you actually dove more into the data, into the evidence, you change your mind about, how to do certain things for specific nutrition principles?
So this is gonna ruffle some fucking feathers up in here. A lot of people are probably gonna get upset when I say this, and they're probably not gonna like me afterwards. But who gives a fuck? So,
love it, dude.
So when I first started, and even when I did my nutrition cert training, I used to believe that organic, was superior in every single sense. I used to believe that conventional farming was bad, and also the different stuff, all these other different things. But then when I got introduced to the science and I understand the science and understanding how GMOs are made and stuff like that, I started to realize that there's no really advantage to choosing organic over conventional. It's really just personal preference. And oftentimes for people in socioeconomic situations, it's better for them to choose the conventional produce. It's cheaper for them. And a lot of times they don't eat fruits and vegetables. So I have to think more pragmatically about certain things. And then when you get into the discussion about GMOs, most of the crops that we have nowadays, unless we're foraging for berries on the fucking plains and the fields or whatever the hell, is a GMO. So they're not bad. They're not inherently evil. So I think it ties into when you talk about confirmation bias, also this idea that what is natural is somehow better or healthier for us, and that's not necessarily the case. Cobra venom is natural. It's not good for you. So we have to have a more nuanced conversation about these topics. And it was really fucking tough for me to look at the literature and open up about these things, because I used to be in the holistic health community, and that was the biggest thing. Eat organic, no GMO and shit like that. And then I started to realize, like, yo, this makes no sense. Like, why I gotta spend like $2 more on organic bananas, and they almost are the same shit as as conventional ones, you know? So it's like I'm only choosing this to empty out my wallet faster. And because I like organic bananas, not because there's a big difference between them, you know? And that was really tough for me. It was really tough.
Yeah, and I think even people that switch into those kinds of like, because I agree wholeheartedly with you. And I don't like eat organic everything. You know, I think because obviously I don't always like look at like the 10,000 foot view as well. So I think this thing kind of shut up. Can you hear me?
Yeah, okay,
Okay,
yeah.
perfect. Yeah. So I don't know, like something kind of like got unplugged in here or something. But anyways, I think something else that kind of like happened with many people is like, for example, like number one, they something works for them. So like let's say for example they did like they went and switched it to all organic, and they're like, oh my god, I feel amazing, and they have all these different things. So now they're confirming that the switch and stuff that they made is the reason why they feel amazing. So how did you like? Let's say somebody like, oh, this worked for me. The same thing happens to keto, like lost a bunch of weight. You're a good example of that. So how do you combat that? And then what is your typical response to some people like that when they say, oh, this is working for me, or like this worked for me the moment that I switched to all organic foods, or X,
Yeah.
insert blank, whatever diet or whatever it is.
So I feel like it ties a lot into our self-absorption. We think that we're more important than we are. You know, so we think that what works for us must work for everyone, right? And it's not necessarily the case, because not everyone is like us. Not everyone has the same situations going on, the same health conditions, etc. So when we look at the evidence hierarchy, right, you know, it's going to get a little complicated, but at the bottom of the totem pole is anecdotal evidence. And when you talk about personal experience and testimonies, that's anecdotal evidence. The problem with anecdotal evidence is that it can be refuted by another antidote. So it's like, all right, organic worked for you, so you think it works for everybody. I could sit there and say organic didn't work for me, so it doesn't work for anyone. And that'll be logically equivalent. That'll be the same shit. It'll be just as strong of an argument as your argument. So it's really unreliable. What works for you? It's such an unreliable argument, because many different contributing factors could have played a role into why you felt better from doing organic. First and foremost, how did your dietary pattern look before you went organic or before you went keto compared to after? And what is your physical activity looking like, your sleep? You know, there's so many different fucking factors, and people don't realize that when you make these switches, other things switch as well, and they could definitely play a role into why they're feeling better. You know, I had this one guy that was swearing up and down this supplement was magic. And I'm like, okay, but after you took the supplement, what did you start doing that was different? I started, he said, eating healthier, and I started exercising. So I'm like, okay, so you're going to put all of that weight into your changing, to your health, into one fucking supplement. Meanwhile, you said that you're eating healthier and you're exercising more. Don't you think that has a role in that as well? So this is why I try to make people think about the bigger perspective and try to be self-absorbed and realize that what works for them doesn't work for everyone. And we are awful at establishing causation. So we think that if two things happen at the same time, they must cause one another. That's not necessarily the case at all. So, you know, we have
Yeah.
to realize our ignorance.
Well, and I think it comes down to like it's exactly what you mentioned. Like the key factor here is like what were you doing before you started this? Because like people are motivated by massive drastic changes, and they get
Mm-hmm.
motivated in the first and second week, and they make all this like like literally they get rid of everything in their kitchen and they replace it with all kinds of different things. So of course it works, like because you started incorporating more vegetable. Like when I love when people kind of talk about like, oh, I switched to organic. Well, were you even buying vegetables before? Like that's kind of like
Yeah.
the typical narrative. And I think like, and people always kind of want to find something to confirm their stuff. Even like the people that sell products, like, you know, the Herbalifers and all the different things, like it works because, well, we know that if the people that are losing weight are creating a calorie deficit through specific kind of like, we're just eating shakes every day and like, sure. But
Exactly.
I just feel like they're always kind of trying to find something that confirms something that they're doing. And they're like, yes, I found a superior thing. Superior, I guess like superior, what is it? Superiority? I think it's a way to kind of like think,
Superiority, yeah.
yeah, or specific kind of like dietary trends and then and things like that, just to kind of say, yes, this is actually better for you to be able to. And I think doctors usually kind of implement this. Like there's like a doctor on TikTok that literally was saying like, I lost 125 pounds on keto and intermittent fasting. This is the way that you should do it.
Oh
So
man.
I'm like, what? Like this
it's,
is, yeah, it's crazy.
it's insane. There's this doctor on Twitter. I call him Dr. Troll. His name is Dr. Troll. I don't think he's a dumb guy. I don't think many of these doctors that state these things are dumb. I think they're smart businessmen. I just think that they're horrible at nutrition science and nutrition research. So he lost a lot of weight doing the ketogenic diet, which good for him. He feels better. He feels healthier. The problem is he started this is a fancy word for a lot of you guys at home, but over extrapolating. So he started taking his personal experience and applying it to everyone. Over extrapolating that personal experience and started saying things like, donuts are like cocaine, or like, sugars like heroin and stuff like that. And the problem with making these grand, big ass terms, you need a lot of evidence for it. And a lot of times they don't have this evidence for it. And if you know about metabolism, you know that carbs are not the same as cocaine.
Well, you kind of hear like you kind of hear the people about the sugar, right? And like the parts of the brain that kind of, and that's like I've seen in presentations they talk about like, oh, there's like the same areas that kind of light up in the brain when you eat sugar versus when you eat, like when you do cocaine. So like people get super like, oh, holy shit, like that's why it's happening, right?
Yeah, so I want people to think about this at home. Because I learned a little bit about neuroscience. Just because certain parts of your brain light up does not mean a particular thing, because the brain is so complex. So if you hold hands with the woman that you love, right? Let's say, for instance, you, Andres, you hold the hands with the woman you love, or whoever you love. That probably same part of the brain is going to light up. Does that mean that you're addicted to holding hands? So that's where we have to be careful with these things, because things like music can activate, could light up the dopamine pathways or whatever. Things like holding hands, things like sex, things like eating, so it's like, are you addicted to these things? Not necessarily. There's more context to it, like, than that. Just because certain areas of the brain light up more than others does not mean a particular effect. This is where we get into the association does not equal causation problem, and that's something that people don't understand. And that's all I have to say about that.
No, that makes sense. But and literally, we can literally go down this entire rabbit hole into like trying to understand this. But it all comes down to how people interpret certain things that are heard or said. And I think that's what we kind of like need to sort of like start to making some changes, which obviously leads, because I want to be respectful also of your time. Like what are some like the biggest like recommendations you give people? Like I know you talk about sustainable weight loss at the beginning, and I think it's important for us to kind of start creating, I don't call them rules, just simply like guidelines into everything that we're kind of doing. So what are like your biggest, like if somebody tells you like, hey man, I'm struggling to lose weight, the immediate things that kind of pop in your mind as far as like, hey, here's like something for, like you talked about adherence is number one, and some other things. Like, so what are your biggest kind of like takeaways and recommendations? Not only you as a person that have gone through a weight loss journey, but at the same time, it's like you've also been like, a vehicle of change and educating and teaching other people about weight loss and sustainable weight loss.
So my first, well, I have a few recommendations, but they're general. They're probably going to apply to you. They're probably not going to apply to you out there. My first thing is that we know that a high protein diet is very helpful for long-term sustainable weight loss because of the satiety of protein, and there's a thermic effect of protein. So a certain percentage is burned up for calories when you digest it. A lot of details, whatever. But the general guideline for those in the US is 1 gram of protein per body weight per day. So if you weigh 200 pounds, you should probably eat around 200 grams of protein. And this will also help with, when you're in the weight room trying to train, resistance training, you need enough protein for your muscles. So that's important. Another thing too is making sure your fiber intake is up. So I think the general guideline is 25 grams of fiber per day. I could be off about that, but make sure that your fiber intake is up. And if you make sure your fiber intake is up, you're probably gonna eat more fruits and vegetables. And that's gonna give you a lot of micronutrients that you need. And if you have high fiber, high protein intake, I truly feel like it will probably be easier for you to not only lose weight, but just keep it off if you make it a habit. because of the things that we talked about earlier. And what else? The classic whole grains, if you can, for your carbohydrates, because of of course, the fiber intake of them, the micronutrients, and it digests a little bit slower, so it keeps you fuller for longer. Drink a lot of water. So I like to replace my sugary beverages with water. This is an easy fucking way to cut calories, because people don't realize how much they drink from soda alone. One can probably have like 200 to 250 calories or more. So if you make that change, you'll cut down a lot on your caloric intake. Also pay attention to your snacking. I like to have like high protein snacks. A lot of people like to mindlessly snack on, candy and stuff like that, very high calorie. And I think that's pretty much it.
Yeah, so you're not going to recommend ketones, or you're not going to give
No,
a fat burning supplement, or
no. I feel like if you want to work with someone, either I think they should probably work with you or me, as far as like guidance, because I think that's the hardest part, like getting started and getting that proper guidance. So if people work with like a guy like you and me, I think they're going to make great fucking progress, and of course, like many of these guidelines or recommendations, they have to be tailored to that specific person. So this is even more incentive to work with a coach,
yeah.
work with someone out there like you or me, to really help them succeed.
I agree, dude, and I think that's huge. And again, that's definitely they're not sexy recommendations, right? They're not like it's like really cool, like you got to do this strategy and that kind of thing. Sometimes we even have to kind of paint it in a way, like like that way. So it's like, hey, like, but it's not until they start to understand it, to do it themselves, like the whole high protein thing. All my clients like, oh, I this is a lot more protein I was eating. Yeah, and how are you feeling? Well, I'm more full. I'm not actually eating as much on a daily basis and that type of thing.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit different when it comes down to that. But then again, like there's always going to be something that would either like go against that, or something that kind of gets in the way. But I think at the end of the day, adherence is everything. And I always like tell people, if you want to do keto, like, can you hold on to this for like 10 years? Like, can you do this for like 5 years in a row? And usually it's like, well, why? I just want to do it for 3 months. It's like, that's the point. It's what's the point of doing it for 3 months if you cannot adhere to it in the long term? So, and I think that's kind of like the biggest mistake that a lot of people are like making nowadays. So the sustainability piece is important. Cool, man. Yep. Well, is there anything else that you kind of wanted to share for like the audience when it comes down to weight loss, when it comes down to like nutrition research, or anything like that you feel like would be valuable for them to actually take away from all this conversation as well?
I feel like I said it in another podcast before, but knowledge is liberating. So like, keep an open mind, try to learn more, try to question what you know, and realize that you probably don't know everything when it comes to this. I don't know everything. There's certain topics of discussion I probably don't know about, like the microbiome or some shit. So it's like, be humble. I think that's really important, because then you start to be like those keto doctors, stating some bullshit. And think about people ahead of money. Because we want to help people at the end of the day. If you can make money, great, but we don't want to hit people over the head for a quick buck.
Yeah, I agree. So and with that part of it too, I remember a mentor that told me in college once is like, like knowledge is definitely power, but also the more you know it, the less you know. So like the part of it too, like you're learning new research and you're learning this, and then you kind of like go into like, I need to learn more about this stuff, and it's just like, it's definitely kind of like part of it. But hopefully with this conversation, people can start to understand a little bit that, like the whole journey for weight loss, it can be like difficult and hard, like mentally, but it doesn't have to be complicated from like the standpoint of like the practicality of how to do it. It's just what it is, and I think that's kind of like the main narrative that we kind of like need to take away from all this. So dude, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time. Now we like to finish up this podcast with like what we call the rapid fire questions. So it'd be like the first thing that kind of comes to your head as I ask them, and then we'll obviously tell everybody about how they can find you and how they can kind of like come in contact with you and connect with you. So ready?
Yep. Yeah, sure. I'm probably gonna fuck up.
There's no the first thing that comes to your mind. That's the rule. The first would be like your favorite movement or exercise.
Squat.
Okay, nice. Second one would be, what is like a book that you would recommend anybody to put on their bookshelf? Like if Christmas comes, you would gift it to them.
Calling Bullshit.
Ooh, I never heard of that. Who wrote that book?
Carl Bergstrom.
Okay.
Carl Bergstrom. Yeah,
Got it.
I'll probably message it to you.
Yeah. So we'll make sure we add that in the show notes. Love that one. Um, what about a podcast or a educational resource that is unbiased, objective, and somebody should listen to, whether it's like nutrition or non-nutrition, it doesn't really matter.
I mean, it'd be really biased to say my podcast, but
No, you can definitely do the shameless plug. So what's the name of your podcast?
yeah, The Self Thinker. You know, it's on Apple Podcasts, it's on Spotify, Google Podcasts, is pretty much everywhere. The
Cool.
Self Thinker. But if I want to say like another one, like probably get like a research review like from examine.com. I love their research review and their information. Really unbiased. It's
I
really
love
good.
those. Yep. Great. That's a good resource. The last one would be if you were stranded on a desert island for the rest of your life and you could only pick one food and one food only to live off of, what would you choose?
Shit, that's hard. I think like nachos. I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice. That's a good one. I've heard all kinds of different things too, from like pineapples and mangoes to like lasagna and poke bowl. So there's
I
definitely
don't know. That's weird.
there's not a wrong answer there, dude. So awesome. So dude, thank you for your time. How can people find you, read about you? You just mentioned your Self Thinker podcast. We're definitely going to make sure we link that up on the show notes. Is there any other way that people can kind of like come in contact with you and follow you?
So I'm active on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. My Instagram handle is at Mr. Cogfit, so it's at mr.cogfit.
Where did that come from, dude? Like, where did that name come from? I forgot to ask you. I wanted to ask you earlier today.
So that it derives from the concept of cognitive fitness. Sorry. So it was the idea that unless you're good mentally, you can't be good physically, and vice versa.
Yeah.
So that was the idea behind it
Love
from
that.
the research that I was reading. Yeah, so it's Mr. Cogfit. And then for Twitter and TikTok, it's at mrcogfit, so there's no dot. And I connect with everybody, so DM me, and I'll answer a lot of your questions if you have any.
And for people listening to this, definitely Jabien is an amazing resource for unbiased nutrition education, very well researched, and he presents it in a way that is easy for you to understand, which for me is important. We need to make sure we make nutrition digestible, pun intended, for people to understand it in a way that is easy and applicable to them. So Jabien, Mr. Cockfig, thank you so much for being on the podcast here today, man. And I look forward to getting this episode released, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah, thank you for having me, man.